Not long after I started my second year of uni, I met a lad named Andy Walker, and there was something of a pattern to mine and Walker's friendship, one that invariably involved him getting me out of trouble. Like the time he got me a job at the bar where he was a supervisor, and I somehow lost my shoes, and I had to call him to say something like, "Mate, I can't come to work, I've lost my shoes." And then, when I assured him it wasn't an excuse, he loaned me some money for a taxi into town so I could buy a new pair. And that was just one of the many times he got me out of trouble. And by the time we graduated, I'd have done pretty much anything for Walker. But little did I know that the promise I'd do anything for him was going to be put to the test in the most rigorous way possible. After graduation, Walker and I ended up moving in together. And then, about a year later, he announced that he was going to be traveling around Thailand for 6 months. Now, I was gutted that he was leaving, but I was also made up that he was doing something so cool. And then it was bear hugs all around when the day of his departure came. After that, we kept in touch, which was how I found out that he was staying in Thailand for another 6 months. But then, a month or two after that, he stopped replying to my emails. I didn't think anything of it at first, but when 1 week without hearing from him turned into 3, I sent him a message asking if he was all right and how the trip was going. About a week later, he replied, saying that everything was fine and that he was in the very far north of Thailand, visiting a sort of commune. He explained that there was a village out there in the middle of nowhere where tourists could live wild for a while before going back to civilization. He'd been up to all kinds of crazy stuff out there. He'd learned how to drive, how to perform traditional Thai tattoos. He went to all these Buddhist temples to undergo monk training too. So I thought the commune thing was just another one of his little adventures. That message was the last I ever received from Walker by email. When a full 2 months went by and I still hadn't heard from him again, I started to worry that he'd sort of moved on and found new friends among the people he was traveling with. And it hurt, thinking that he didn't care enough to make time to email me. But I wasn't his owner, so thoughts like that made me feel guilty enough to shove all my worries down and ignore them. But then, maybe a week or so after that 2-month period of silence had passed, I got a call from Walker's mom, and she did not sound happy. I had assumed Walker would be keeping in touch with his mom as a matter of priority. Hearing that only cemented my concern. When I told her that I hadn't heard from him either, she said she was going to contact the police in Thailand to report him missing. I asked her to keep me updated, but when she did, it wasn't good news. The Thai police tracked Walker down to a small jungle commune near the border of Myanmar. He insisted that he was fine and that he was there of his own free will. Because his visa was still valid, the Thai police couldn't exactly drag him back to Bangkok. When they asked him to contact his family because they were worried about him, Walker didn't do that. The police also said he looked very unwell when they found him, and from the way he spoke to them, they suspected he was either heavily abusing drugs or experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. We were devastated. Something was happening over there, and Walker was suffering. I had no idea what to do, but it turned out Walker's mom had a plan. Walker's dad had passed away some years earlier, and since his sister was disabled and his mom had health problems, they were in no position to fly to Thailand. But I was. I had the means and the willingness, and the only thing I lacked was the money. Walker's mom, Margaret Walker, said that she and his sister were willing to cover the entire trip. It was surreal, honestly, not just because of what was being asked of me, but because I always thought that if anything happened, Walker would be the one rescuing me from something like this. I never would have refused the request. After arranging time off from work, I flew to Thailand to bring Walker home. After the 17-hour flight, I was completely exhausted. That first day was spent resting and adjusting to the time difference. Once I was up and moving again, Margaret Walker, Andy Walker's mom, sent an email explaining where I needed to go and what I had to do. That 17-hour flight turned out to be only the first part of the journey, because the next leg involved a 14-hour bus ride from Bangkok to a small town in the far north called Mae Hong Son. That bus ride made the flight feel easy by comparison, and it was made even worse by the fact that I became severely travel sick on the rougher roads. It was in Mae Hong Son that I met a local guide named Somchai. Somchai had heard of the remote jungle village where Western tourists supposedly went native, and Walker's mom had arranged for him to guide me, just not all the way there. Somchai told me that the area I was trying to reach was full of bad people. There were smugglers, bandits, armed rebels, and gun-toting poppy farmers guarding their fields. It was completely lawless out there. But that was exactly why Walker's commune chose to base themselves there, so they could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And while that might sound like a good thing on the surface, Somchai assured me it wasn't. He said the only reports he'd ever heard about the commune described it as a village full of crazy Farang, which is the Thai word for foreigners. He said the village used to be called Ban Hoi Prai, and that many Thai people once lived there. But as more of the crazy Farang moved in, more Thai families began to leave. And after maybe 10 years or so, there were only a handful of Thai people left, acting as go-betweens for the Farang, who now called the village Peace Town. I suggested to Somchai that if a bunch of hippies could manage to live out there, then surely we would be fine too. But Somchai told me that wasn't the case. Not only did Peacetown pay a hefty protection fee to local smugglers, you couldn't just walk up and ask to live there. You had to be recruited in places like Bangkok or Phuket, and they only recruited people who were fanatically dedicated to their cause. That didn't sound like Walker at all. The only thing I'd ever known him to be fanatically dedicated to was his beloved football club, Sheffield Wednesday. But we knew he was there, so there was no chance I was about to back out, especially not after coming so far. Somchai said the walk to Peacetown would take 2 days, which meant an overnight stay in a small village called Ban Mae La. The only catch was that it was controlled by Karen insurgents. It was unsettling to see so many people walking around with guns, especially when many of them looked no older than teenagers. But the 9-hour hike through the jungle was so grueling that I was too exhausted to care. For the most part, all I wanted was food and a place to lie down, and the village had both. After dinner, Somchai and I were shown to the place where we would be staying for the night. We were both shattered and wanted nothing but sleep. But around 9 that evening, a young man with a gun stuck his head into the shack and said something to Somchai in Burmese. Somchai told me we had to go to the center of the village because every evening the rebel commander gave a speech, and everyone, guests included, had to attend. We walked through the village until we reached a clearing between the houses. There must have been 100 people there, all gathered in a semicircle around 2 men. And everyone who noticed me simply stopped and stared. The crowd was a mix of villagers and Karen insurgents, recognizable by the random pieces of camouflage they wore, and the weapons slung over their shoulders. The 2 men at the front were also Karen insurgents, but only one was standing, while the other was on his knees with his hands tied behind his back. I asked Somchai what was happening, but he said he did not know. I kept hoping Somchai could reassure me that the man on his knees was not about to die. But he could not do that. Not because he did not speak Burmese, but because that was exactly what was about to happen. The man on his feet gave a long speech about how the other man was a traitor. At the end, he raised the gun, and a group of volunteers jumped to attention. He handed the gun to one of them. Then the volunteers stepped forward and unloaded a handgun into the kneeling man. After that, there was a huge cheer. Somchai and I were completely shell-shocked, standing there in silence as people rushed over and began kicking and stomping on the dead man's body. Only then was it safe for us to walk back to our shack and try to get some sleep. As you can imagine, sleep did not come easily anymore. I remember lying on that cot, listening to someone firing a gun in celebration, when Samchai quietly said, "We should not have come here, Caleb." He was right. I was absolutely terrified. But it was just as true that I had to be there. I had no choice but to keep going. Walking away would have been the easiest thing in the world, but to me, there was more chance of a pig flying over us in the jungle. So we stayed in our shack, managed to get a few hours of sleep, and were up at the crack of dawn the next morning, moving again. I feel like I have glossed over this part, but walking through the jungle was an extremely stressful experience. Sometimes it was frightening, because there were real tigers moving through the same jungle as us. Most of the time, though, it was a mix of total exhaustion from the heat and humidity and complete disorientation, because everything looked the same to me. Samchai walked with me for a few hours, and when we reached a small stream cutting through the jungle, he stopped and said that was as far as he would go. I asked him to come with me, stopping just short of begging. As sorry as he said he was, he could not. The way he wished me luck, with a sad look on his face, made me think, I am definitely going to die out here. I was absolutely cacking myself, but Samchai told me that as long as I followed the stream, I would make it to Peacetown by sundown. He had given me just 2 warnings. First, if I ever saw a tiger, I was not to run right away. I was told to throw my pack at it if it charged, and only then try to run. Second, he warned me there was a village ahead, the only one I would see before reaching Peacetown, and that I was not to stop there, which I only truly understood once I arrived. Samchai said it was a bad place, known for bandits, and that if I stopped, someone would scam me, and if I did not move fast enough, they would chase me, rob me, and hurt me. But it was not armed men that I noticed as I approached. It was only a group of children playing by a stream. They were naturally curious about the big foreigner walking toward their village. They came downstream toward me to get a closer look, and one of them was holding what looked like a can of paint and drinking from it. Because they were by the stream, I assumed it was water, but when the little girl came close, I could smell the fumes coming from whatever she was drinking. I was so shocked that I spoke to her in English and asked what on earth she was drinking. She clearly did not understand what I was saying. But even if she had spoken English, I doubt she would have understood, because she was completely drunk. The little girl laughed when I spoke, and her friends joined in. I could not tell if they were drunk too, but they followed me through the entire village and only stopped once the adults pushed them aside. As I walked through the village, I was offered just about everything imaginable. Drugs, women, guns, even a wife. All of it was offered openly. Once I made it through, I did not know whether to fear the tigers more or the bandits. When several hours passed without any armed men emerging from the trees, I convinced myself I had survived the worst of it. But I was wrong. It was almost sunset when I spotted another cluster of buildings further upstream. I was not even within 50 meters when 2 men ran out to meet me. They were white men, deeply tanned, with sandy blonde hair, and they were carrying primitive-looking spears. When they got close, they leveled the spears at me. One of them spoke in a rough Australian accent and said that I looked lost and should turn around before I got myself hurt. I was so exhausted that it was hard to get the words out, but I managed to explain that I was looking for someone named Andy Walker, who might also be going by the name Walker. Now, the other bloke, who sounded German or Austrian or something, said that there weren't any Andys living there, and then demanded to know who I was. After I made it clear that I was a friend of his, and that if Walker really wasn't there, then I just wanted to know where he'd gone, the 2 blokes started to soften a bit. They stopped pointing their spears at me, and after telling me to wait right where I was, one of them ran back into the village. He came back a few minutes later and nodded to his mate, who then led me inside. I don't know if many of you remember that Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone thing that happened in Seattle in 2020, but seeing it on the news later reminded me a lot of Peacetown. All the other small towns and villages I'd seen, with the exception of one, had been neat, tidy, and orderly. But this place had graffiti all over the houses. Everything was overgrown, and it was complete chaos. There were drum circles, people were dancing nude, and the smells of weed and patchouli hit you like a 1-2 punch. And there were people with guns spaced among the groups, wearing shades and looking very sinister. One of the spear-carrying Aussies led me to a small concrete house, then just said, "There, mate, have a good one," and walked off. I walked inside and saw the skinny, hairy bloke looking up at me from a table, and it took about 10 seconds to realize the Charlie Manson look-alike in front of me was Walker, and I said, "Andy Walker." Then, almost like it took him a second to recognize me too, his eyes suddenly lit up and he shouted, "Caleb!" He acted like his usual old self. After a big hug, he asked me what I was doing in Thailand, and I told him I was there to bring him home. He didn't react badly at all. He just calmly, almost confused, asked me, "Really? Why?" And that was when things started to go downhill. I told him to take a look at himself in the mirror and see how skinny he'd gotten, and how unhinged he looked with his long hair and beard. Walker took it as an insult and started asking what my problem was. That was when I completely lost my rag. I told him my problem was that he'd scared his mom and sister so badly that they'd literally paid me to bring him home, or at least try. I also told him I had a big problem with him acting like nothing was going on, like he hadn't done a complete 180 and started living like a hippie in one of the most dangerous places on earth. A lot of shouting followed after that, to the point where someone came in looking like they were ready to batter me in Walker's defense. We cooled down a bit after that, and Walker said he'd arranged a bed for me, so I'd at least have somewhere to sleep. After that, while we were carrying a mattress into his small stone shack, Walker apologized, but only for acting aloof and pretending like he hadn't dropped out of life, because that was exactly what he intended to do. He said it wasn't until he got to Thailand that he realized how much he hated his life back home. Then he went on about how he hated the corrupt system back home, and how he refused to be a wage slave until he died. What he said made sense in parts. Life isn't fair. But his solution was to give up on it. When I talked about how worried his family were, I could see that I was getting through to him. But when he demanded that we change the subject and talk about it more in the morning, I knew that getting him to think about family was the way to get him home. So I didn't mind waiting to do it. I thought that day would end with us walking back toward civilization. But in reality, it ended with me thinking that I'd never get to leave. The next morning, after a bit of breakfast, Walker said he wanted to show me around the village. It was basically a propaganda tour, with him showing me how good life there could be. I wasn't buying any of it, and I brought up all the good things about life back home as much as I could. Just like the night before, I could see that I was getting to him. After lunch, Walker said there was something he had to go and do. I told him to go handle it and said I'd wait where I was. I thought I'd use the time to catch up on sleep, but no sooner had I kicked my boots off than his new girlfriend, someone named Nadia, came in asking for a chat. I was nervous right away, because it was clear she wasn't happy with me. When I said yes to her question about whether I planned to take Walker home or not, she went mental. She said I was trying to ruin his life, break them up, and bring bad energy into the village. I told her I was doing nothing of the sort, but Nadia wasn't having any of it. She told me to leave and never come back. But when I refused, she pulled out a large, folding knife. I think it was more an involuntary, nervous kind of laughter, but it slipped out as I asked her, "What, Are you going to stab me in the Peacetown village?" And I didn't think she was serious. I honestly thought she was just some unhinged woman trying to scare me a little bit. So when she suddenly lunged at me and actually tried to stab me, I couldn't believe it. I started screaming, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what are you doing?" at the top of my lungs, knowing my best chance of getting her away from me was alerting other people. And the little stone house was just that. Little. It wasn't long before I was completely cornered, with no choice but to defend myself. I really didn't want to do what I did, so please don't think I took any pleasure in it at all. But I hit her, and the impact sent her reeling, with a thin trickle of blood running from her nose, just as Walker and a few others came rushing into the house. Nadia immediately started screaming bloody murder about how I'd hit her out of nowhere, which led them to basically frog march me out of the house and towards some kind of makeshift holding cell. Walker was there, but he wasn't one of the guys dragging me off. He looked distraught when I admitted to hitting her, and even more so when I kept saying, "Mate, I swear to God she tried to stab me," as I was being pulled away. I don't think I'd have known what to do either, so I didn't hold a grudge against him for just standing there and doing nothing. But at the time, being barricaded inside that tiny shed with an armed mob outside and having Walker do nothing about it made me furious. That anger didn't last long, though, because after a visit from someone whose face I couldn't see, all I felt was fear. I couldn't see his face because he stayed on the other side of the shed door while talking to me. I was told I'd be publicly punished for punching Walker's girlfriend. My first thought was how, so that's what I asked. The only response was the sound of footsteps on the other side of the door, getting quieter and quieter until they were gone. I'm not ashamed to say I've never been that terrified in my life. I genuinely believed they were going to kill me. I couldn't shake the image of that man being shot on his knees and how happy everyone had seemed when it happened. I was convinced the same thing was going to happen to me, but if I tried to escape, the armed guard outside the shed would almost certainly shoot me. So I stayed where I was and told myself to wait for a better opportunity. Once it was fully dark, I remember hearing someone walk up to the guard outside the shed, and then recognizing Walker's voice when he spoke. I felt relieved at first. I thought they were going to let me go. But when he opened the door, and I saw Walker standing there with a handgun in his grip, my heart dropped. When I asked him what the gun was for, he didn't answer. He only told me to get up and come out of the shed. When I did, Walker pointed toward the jungle and told me to start walking. I kept asking why he had the gun with him over and over, but he didn't say a word. Then it hit me. They were going to shoot me, and Walker had volunteered to do it. I begged him not to. I brought up all the time we'd shared and how his mom missed him, but all he said was, "Shut up and walk, Caleb." Anytime I tried to get him to listen, he just kept marching me deeper into the jungle, with me begging and pleading the entire way, until he finally told me to stop. When I did, Walker told me to turn around, but he didn't have the gun aimed at me like I expected. Instead, he just said, "Hit me." When Walker said it a second time, it made no more sense than the first. But when he added that it had to look real, I suddenly understood his plan. I asked where, and he told me to just get it over with. So I hit him. I tried to aim for his lips, and it worked a little too well, because the second he was knocked back, blood came out of his mouth. I told him I was sorry, but Walker just shook his head. As he spat again, he raised a hand as if to say it was fine, that he had asked for it. He then told me that once I was a safe distance away, he would fire 3 shots into the air, shots he would claim were aimed at me after I punched him and ran. After that, it was up to me to reach the next village on my own, which would take all night. He gave me a torch and a compass, and told me to keep going north, no matter what. Then wished me luck. The last thing he did was make me promise him something. Then I turned and ran. I remember hearing the gunshots behind me, and the situation was so twisted that I was actually glad to hear them. I knew it meant I had to keep moving, but the shots might also scare off any animals nearby. Animals that might have otherwise made me a midnight snack. Reaching the village didn't take all night, but at one point I heard shouting behind me, where a nearby town had probably sent out search parties looking for me. Thankfully, Walker had given me such a big head start that they never caught up, not even while I was moving at a walking pace. But the thought of what they might do if they caught me was still terrifying. When I finally reached the next village, I knocked on the first door I came to. Anywhere else, you might expect people to tell you to go away if you woke them in the middle of the night. But the Thai family who lived there were quietly kind and understanding, and they helped me get back to Mae Hong Son the next morning, which was the village where I had started and where I reunited with Somchai. When I showed up at his house, he could not believe I was alive. We were so relieved to see each other that we actually hugged. After that, it was simply a matter of retracing my steps, including the 13-hour bus ride back to Bangkok. The most difficult part came after I flew back to the UK, because I had to meet with Walker's mother and carry out the promise I had made to him. That meant lying to her and telling her that he was dead. He told me he could not leave, that people would be hurt if he tried, and that he could not allow that to happen. He also said he was too far gone to come home, that he would never adjust, and that it would all end in disaster if he tried. Taking all of that into account, he believed it was better for his mother and sister to think he was dead. But I did not agree. And even though I had promised him I would convince them, I could not bring myself to do it. I tried, honestly, but I broke down after just a few words and had to tell them the truth. I said I had failed and that I would probably spend the rest of my life regretting that failure. They trusted me to see it through, to bring their son and brother home, and I had been too foolish and weak to manage it. We all cried together as they tried to reassure me that I had done my best and that they were grateful I had even tried. But that did nothing to ease the sense of personal failure I felt. I could not shake the feeling that if I had acted differently, Walker would have been sitting right there with us. That wasn't the only time I saw how dangerous life off the grid could be. Not 10,000 miles away, in a place meant to be heaven, but which had turned out to be hell. Many years ago, at the dawn of the 1990s, I had a best friend named Marissa. We were practically inseparable. It became such a running joke that some people referred to us as a single person, Marin, as in Lauren plus Marissa. We truly believed we would stay joined at the hip until we were old and gray. Then, one day, without any warning at all, Marissa announced that she was moving to Nevada. But I guess I shouldn't have been totally surprised, and here's why. About a month before she announced the move, Marissa's grandma passed away and left her a large sum of money. Since the estate was being divided among all of Marissa's siblings and cousins, I assumed it would be a couple thousand at most. But when I asked how much she'd actually received, Marissa said it was a life-changing amount and that technically she would never have to work again. It turned out Marissa's grandmother, Evelyn, was something of an investment guru, or more accurately, she hired someone who was, and entrusted them with a large portion of her pension to invest. That person turned out to be very good at what they did, meaning that by the time she died, Evelyn was worth tens of millions of dollars. I know money can't replace someone you love, but having lost someone myself at a young age, I can say that receiving enough money to solve your financial problems does soften the blow a little. Not entirely, but it does. That wasn't the case with Marissa, though. Instead of opening some new and exciting chapter in her life, her grandma's death triggered a deep and long-buried anxiety about mortality. Marissa began to reevaluate everything that wasn't a relationship with the people closest to her, and she realized she hated living in California. She realized she hated her job, and she realized she wanted much more out of life. After a long period of self-reflection, she finally dropped the news about Nevada. Given how much money she had, I assumed she'd chosen a nice place to live. Not a mansion or anything like that, since it wasn't her style. But at the very least, I expected her to buy a house. She didn't. When she showed me where she was moving, I was stunned. Because Marissa wasn't moving into a house at all. She was moving into an Amargosa Flats trailer park in the desert that was so run down it was mostly abandoned. She asked me to go check the place out with her, just to make sure it was livable. That word only applied in the loosest possible sense, but it was still enough for her to make the decision right then and there. She was moving, and the Amargosa Flats trailer park would be her new home. My boyfriend and I helped her move, and about 3 weeks later, we went to visit to see how she was doing. What we saw surprised us. Marissa had gone from living a fairly basic life to living almost completely off the grid. She had no phone line, no running water, and the only electricity she had came from a generator she kept fueled with propane. But make no mistake, while it might sound like she was choosing poverty, her setup was surprisingly comfortable. By the time we visited, she had decorated the trailer beautifully, inside and out. She had a TV with a satellite dish that picked up a few local stations. She had a small greenhouse so she could grow vegetables, and mounted on top of the trailer, angled up toward the sky, was a telescope. Now, I'd gone from being deeply skeptical to fully understanding her vision for moving out there. It was quiet and peaceful, and the scenery was actually very pretty, especially for the desert. The only catch seemed to be the terms of the lease, or, more accurately, the absence of any real terms at all. Marissa said she paid her landlord $10 a month, and she was fairly certain it was off the books. I remember feeling uneasy about that, because if anything went wrong, the landlord had no obligation to fix it. Marissa didn't care. She wanted that level of independence, and she didn't want to rely on anyone but herself. At first, I thought it was cool as hell. My best friend was living out this new dream of hers, and making it happen not just because of the money she'd gotten, but because she was working relentlessly to keep it going. I was proud of her, truly proud. But then, things started to go wrong. One day, I got a call from Marissa's sister, saying she was worried about her. I assumed something had gone wrong with the trailer or that sketchy landlord, but her sister said it felt more like a psychological breakdown. It was one I had already noticed signs of, without fully understanding them at the time. Before the move, Marissa had been interested in plenty of things, but astronomy had never been one of them. So when I noticed the telescope on top of her trailer and asked about the new hobby, she said the night sky was so clear that it felt like a natural addition. She wasn't wrong. I can only imagine how beautiful the stars must have looked through it on a clear desert night. What she didn't tell me was that she hadn't been honest about her reasons for moving out there. She had hidden them well. The next time I visited, though, it was unmistakably a moment where the mask finally came off. Between my last visit and that one, I went through my first pregnancy and gave birth to my daughter. By the time her sister called, I hadn't seen Marissa in almost 8 months. I drove out to share the news that I was pregnant, but I was also deeply uneasy during that trip, all because of what her sister had told me on the phone. She said Marissa had been saying some pretty disturbing things, and very little of it made any real sense. She didn't say much more than that, but it was worrying enough on its own. So I drove out to see her the very next day. Marissa was outside when I pulled into the Amargosa Flats trailer park, tending to some of the vegetables she was growing in her small greenhouse. When she saw me coming, she ran to my car and gave me a big hug as I stepped out. She asked about my daughter and what it was like being a mom. At first, everything seemed completely normal. Her trailer and the space around it looked better than ever, with that telescope still sitting on top. I asked her how she was doing, and she told me she was great. She didn't say anything strange or unhinged, only that the dry desert air had been rough on her skin, and that she was going to make whoever made her moisturizer a very rich person, which sounded surprisingly level-headed for someone who was supposedly having a mental breakdown. But then we walked into her trailer, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. Almost every visible surface, both horizontal and vertical, was covered in posters, paintings, and small knickknacks. Every single one of them shared the same theme: aliens. There were framed photos of so-called UFO sightings, some with dates and times engraved on small metal labels attached to the frames. She also had corny little green alien figurines scattered everywhere, most of them picked up from dusty tourist traps around Area 51. A cluster of small UFO models hung from the ceiling, and little green men plush toys filled every corner of her built-in couch. Her bookshelf had swollen with at least 24 books about extraterrestrial visitations, encounters, and abductions. I looked around and said, "Marissa, is there anything you'd like to tell me about your choice of decor?" She just sighed and said that her sister had called me, hadn't she? I admitted that she had, then asked Marissa for some honesty of her own. Something was going on with her, and I wanted to hear it directly from her. Over the next hour or so, Marissa explained her newfound obsession. On the surface, though, there didn't seem to be anything especially alarming. Her grandmother's passing and the inheritance she received had clearly made her question what she wanted out of life. During that kind of quarter-life crisis, she started wondering whether the truth really was out there. She began doing a little research into UFO phenomena, and that little slowly turned into a lot, until a lot became an all-day, everyday fixation. She found all aspects of the subject fascinating, which, on the surface, seemed totally harmless. But as I came to find out, it was not just a casual interest. In so many words, and as I listened in total horror, Marissa explained that she had thought long and hard about her purpose in the world, as well as who she was, and had decided that she did not belong on Earth. And now, out of context, that might have sounded even more frightening than the reality. But she did not mean it in a self-destructive way. Not entirely, anyway. And so, Marissa had come to believe that her origins lay on some other planet, one that was not even in our solar system. She subscribed to the belief that aliens were walking among us, but not in the sense that they were wearing skin suits and pretending to be human. It was more like certain people had extraterrestrial souls planted within them, and she believed she was one of them. And that was not all either. Marissa had been tracking North American UFO sightings for quite some time and claimed to have noticed a dramatic increase in recent reports. She also said she had observed increased activity around Area 51, which she monitored frequently, and this had led her to the deeply shocking conclusion that she was due to return home. I remember listening in silence while she went on and on about how they were going to pick her up and take her home, and how she would finally be in a place where she truly belonged. It felt like a roller coaster of emotion. I was scared, upset, and angry at the people she had been talking to, the ones who had filled her head with all this nonsense about Greys and Anunnaki. I did not know whether to laugh, cry, or yell at her. All I could do was listen with growing horror as she eventually revealed that she was due to return home very soon, maybe even that night. Marissa was so confident that she was going to be visited by aliens that she invited me to stay at her place that night so I could witness it for myself. And apparently, even if they did not come to pick her up, UFOs had been doing flybys of her trailer, so I would almost certainly see one of those if I stayed up late enough with her. And using the phone that belonged to Marissa's landlord, I called my boyfriend to let him know what was happening and that I would be staying with Marissa for the night to keep an eye on her. He asked if I wanted him to join us, but I said no. I wanted it to look like a sleepover, not the intervention it really was. Then it was back to the trailer to keep Marissa as grounded as possible. By that, I mean talking about earthly things instead of anything celestial. I talked about high school, about movies, and about things happening back in California where she used to live. The last thing I wanted was to talk about aliens, because I did not quite know how I was going to confront her about it yet. I thought I was doing a good job, too, because she seemed content to avoid the subject as the night went on. But then, all of a sudden, she glanced at her watch and said, "All right, it's time." Marissa asked if I wanted to join her to go spotting, as she called it, which meant a short walk out to a bluff overlooking a valley. I stayed very neutral when I said, sure, and figured that when nothing happened, that would be my moment to step in and talk her out of everything. It turned into a very beautiful walk. The night sky out there in the desert was absolutely breathtaking. Then, to my surprise, once we reached our spot, we started to see small lights blinking on the distant horizon. Marissa said the part of the sky we were watching sat directly over Area 51, and that the government used reverse-engineered UFO technology to signal and communicate with aliens. I suggested they were probably test flights, because I had heard that was common out there. When I said that, Marissa shot me an irritated look, and then said loudly, "No, Lauren, I know what I'm talking about, so don't patronize me like that." The sudden outburst scared me badly. Marissa had not snapped at me like that since our college days, during the biggest fight of our entire friendship. Back then, it had been over something very real and very important. This time, it terrified me because it was over some damned flying saucers. I could not even reassure myself by thinking she was drunk or high, because she stayed sober all night. The UFOs were not coming out of a bottle. They were coming from her own mind. I did not push it. I simply said that I had heard they were test flights and that I was no expert. Marissa calmed down a bit and kept explaining her thoughts. She had brought a boombox from her trailer, which I assumed was for listening to music while we searched for UFOs. But after she finished her speech about how she was successfully signaling the aliens herself, she turned to the boombox and pressed play. As strange beeps and electronic tones poured from the speakers, Marissa faced the distant lights and began to sway, almost like she was dancing. That's what it looked like anyway, but I guess she was making symbols with her arms and sometimes her legs that the aliens could understand. And the beeps and boops were completely out of rhythm and shifted through different pitches. There was no music to it at all. It was more like a code Marissa thought might get the aliens' attention. I was too stunned to say anything at first, but what surprised me even more was that as Marissa kept up her strange little dance, the distant light began to grow larger as whatever was out there moved closer. I couldn't hear any engines or anything like that, and I know you can usually hear plane engines from about a mile away, but aside from those strange beeps, there was almost total silence. Nothing but crickets. It was unsettling, but I still figured we were probably just watching some kind of Air Force test flights. So as Marissa grew more and more worked up, and her movements became faster and more frantic, I picked my moment to step in. I started telling her, "Marissa, I don't think they're UFOs. I think you're all worked up, and it's just turning into this obsession with aliens." Marissa completely ignored me, throwing her limbs out, locking them stiff, then switching between positions. I swear the lights grew just a little bigger when she did that. It could have been a trick of the light, but if it was, Marissa saw it too. She said, "You see, it's working," sounding completely out of breath, but almost as soon as she spoke, the light began to fade and then blinked out entirely. There was a brief silence as Marissa stopped dancing, and then she started walking toward the horizon as the tape playing those strange beeps finally came to an end. Marissa didn't turn to look at me. She didn't even move at first, but I could see how tense she was. Every small muscle looked stretched to the point of snapping, and then she exploded. She turned and ran straight at me, screaming, "You messed it up! They were coming for me, and you messed it up!" I kept saying, "No, wait!" But it didn't do a damn thing. I only managed to back up a couple of steps before she slammed into me, and we both hit the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me so badly I could barely breathe. Then the next thing I knew, Marissa had her hands wrapped around my throat, squeezing as hard as she could. She kept screaming that I had ruined everything, that she was going to kill me. I tried to grab one of her wrists, but she yanked it free and punched me so hard in the face that my vision flashed white when I shut my eyes. I tried to lift my head, but she hit me again, and I tasted blood in my mouth. I think if it had been anyone else, a man for example, I would have been in serious trouble. But once I started to really fight back, I was able to get her off me. I had always been the taller and more athletic of the two of us, and although it was by no means easy, it didn't take long before I had Marissa overpowered. After that, it was my turn to yell for her to calm down before I started hitting her back. She struggled hard, and at one point, she even tried to bite me. But once she began to tire out, she actually started talking. And when she started talking, I was able to calm her by asking what the hell had gotten into her. That was when Marissa finally broke down. I won't bore you with all the little details of what came after, but let's just say that Marissa doesn't live in the Amargosa Flats trailer park anymore. She lives somewhere a little closer to home and leads a fairly regular life, considering her circumstances. I guess the strangest part of the whole thing for me is that Marissa is still into UFOs and other alien phenomena, but now she enjoys it in a healthy, humorous way and doesn't let it take over her life. What she went through, her obsession and her delusions, were a manifestation of something much deeper. Something that started when she began to believe her life had no purpose. It was made worse by the grief she felt after losing her grandma as well. That was something she didn't realize she wasn't over until after the big fight we had. She volunteers with animals now, and we still hang out from time to time whenever we're both free. Marissa sometimes apologizes for attacking me that night after she lost her mind, but I tell her it's all water under the bridge. Besides, it would take a lot more than a few fistfights in the desert to ruin a friendship as perfect as ours. So, a long time ago, when I was a much younger man, I used to ride a motorcycle around the country while living as something of a nomad. I could write a whole book about the reasons I chose to live like that, so I'll skip all of it, and instead tell what might be the creepiest and most frightening story from all my travels. I used to stop at all kinds of places, hotels, motels, holiday inns, as they say. But sometimes I wasn't lucky enough to find a soft mattress or a locked door, and I had to beg, borrow, or steal a place to sleep. One time in Wyoming, I drove for miles through the night and didn't see so much as a gas station for hours. Then, finally, I rolled into the outskirts of Rawlins that had a bar which looked like it was still open. A reliable way to find a couch to sleep on was to buy a barfly a couple of beers and then offer to drive him home in exchange for a place to rest. This was generally pretty safe, as 99% of the time they had passed out upon contact with any soft surface. And I actually got to take a shower and help myself to whatever was in the fridge before getting a few hours of shut-eye. Now, I wasn't stealing. I always asked if I could make myself at home. And for the most part, no one ever meant me any harm. But there's always that one small exception that proves the rule. And so I was rolling through the middle of nowhere when I saw that bar I mentioned, and I figured it was my one solid option for finding a place to sleep. I parked my bike outside and headed through the doors. Right away, I could see my candidate leaning against the bar. He was a big, tubby guy, like a red bear claws, sharing a hearty laugh with a bartender who was calling him by name. I set a few stools down from him and ordered a beer. A few minutes later, since he hadn't seen me around before, he started asking where I was from. I told him my story and bought him a beer when he ran dry. Before long, we were talking like old friends. We swapped stories and talked sports. Eventually, the bartender very lovingly told us both to get lost. He told me his wife was at his sister's, so he didn't even have to ask permission for some hairy biker to sleep in the guest room. Since I'd only had a couple of beers, I gave the red bear, who told me his name was Dale Mercer, a ride home on my bike. We went inside and had a couple more beers. After showing me to the guest bedroom, Dale bid me good night. I should have been out the moment my head hit the pillow, but there was something Dale said just before we called it a night that kept replaying in my mind. He had asked a few more questions about what I was doing. Maybe it was the beer loosening my tongue, but I told him how being a rolling stone meant I had many contacts, but no constants in my life. What I meant by that could be summed up perfectly in one of the things Dale brought up before we retired. As we talked and he posed questions here and there, he suddenly said that if something happened to me, there would be no one who came looking. At one point, it had been a point of pride for me to be truly independent and living off the grid, as they say. It was just me, my bike, and the road ahead. But there were downsides to that too. Downsides I didn't fully explore with Dale that evening, but he sure as hell seemed to pick up on them with that remark of his. And the way he looked at me before we called it made me think it wasn't entirely one of those casual comments. I guess it was an added effect of all those beers, along with my complete lack of alcohol tolerance, that had that warning feeling creeping up on me so slowly. But as I lay there, I realized I was better off getting back on the road than staying put and trying to sleep. And I was never great at trusting regular people anyway. Sometimes I preferred sleeping outside to passing out in front of sketchy strangers. So when that feeling hit, I rolled out of bed and quietly started to get dressed. I put on my shirt and pants, and then I was working on getting my boots on. And then I heard a noise coming from outside in the hallway. Any other time, I would have figured it was just the homeowner going to drain the main vein, so to speak, and it wouldn't have spooked me in the slightest. But that time, hearing that creaking floorboard had me freezing solid with my bootlaces halfway tied. I didn't move. I didn't speak. All I knew was that someone was standing outside the bedroom door, and they weren't moving. I didn't know if it was Dale, someone who had broken in, or Dale's wife coming home early from her sister's place. And so there were a few seconds where I had no idea what the hell I should do. But when I finished tying my boots and got to my feet, Dale decided for me. He was wearing overalls and some kind of mask when he burst into the room, but I could tell just from his shape that it was him. He came charging at me with some kind of mallet in his hands, but thanks to how much he'd had to drink, his swings were powerful and wildly inaccurate. I ducked one way, dodged the next, and then slipped behind him to try to wrap an arm around his neck. I'd done enough hand-to-hand training in the Corps to pull that off without much trouble. But what I wasn't expecting was for Dale to simply fall backward onto his ass and crush me nearly to death in the process. It didn't just knock the wind out of me. It damn near broke my spine as 300 pounds of muscle and beer gut slammed me into the hardwood floor. I had to make sure I wasn't broken in half before I tried to move. But by the time I did, It was already too late. Dale didn't get up. He just rolled slightly so that he was still on top of me. And I'm still not sure why he tried this, but his choice of finisher was trying to shove his fingers into my mouth. I guess he thought it would suffocate me. Here was where I realized the booze had dulled his judgment a little too much, because I could still breathe, and it gave me the chance to bite down on his fingers as hard as I could. And when my teeth sank into his flesh, Dale let out a scream so loud I thought it might have burst my eardrums. He yanked his fingers out of my mouth so hard that it threw him slightly off balance, just enough for me to roll out from under him while he clutched his bleeding hand. When he saw me get to my feet, he tried to do the same, but because he couldn't put any weight on the hand I had bitten, I managed to get the jump on him. I drove the toe of my boot into his chin, knocking the mask clean off his face. The first kick didn't knock him out. The second one did. After one more brutal swing of my boot, Dale was out cold, snoring. I remember seeing blood bubble at his nostrils as I pulled my clothes on as fast as I could. I was terrified he would wake up and we'd have to go through that same struggle all over again. Once I was dressed, I ran back to my bike. I could have robbed him. I could have killed him. But all I wanted was to get as far away as possible. Because it isn't just in the movies that cops don't like drifters.